All right, so it's good to see everybody as usual on a wonderful Tanya Tuesday. Um, we just completed a wonderful holiday of Shavuot, so it's nice to go from the holiday of Shavuot to studying some of the deepest parts of the Torah, hence class on Tanya. And the cool thing about studying the deepest parts of the Torah is that unlike studying the deepest sciences, which may feel very abstract, the deepest parts of the Torah actually make you feel very connected to everything. In other words, when you study the deep secrets of the Torah, you actually understand how it changes the way you view the world and changes how you view your own life. So it's a beautiful thing that God has given us to study the secrets of the Torah that allow us to connect more deeply with ourselves, and with Judaism, with God. And so with that, I'm excited to go on to chapter 43. I just see here I missed one page over here. My pictures on chapter 43. So we're going to be starting chapter 43 in I missed two pages. So chapter 43 in the Tanya, and it's going to be on page 548, but as usual, I have what to say about it first. Let me just check that this uploaded. I guess I just need to refresh my page. Okay. All right, it is there. All right. So welcome back. And we've been on a journey. We've been on a journey the last couple chapters to explain from chapter really 41 more in detail love and awe. In other words, the whole purpose of the Tanya is, as is explained to us, we need to use our mind to awaken our heart, to have feelings towards God. And we explained in previous chapters in the 30s why having emotional feelings to God is important, even though the main thing is the deed, as we say, why it's so important to have emotional feelings. Number one, it makes it easier to do the mitzvah. Number two, God wants the soul of the mitzvah. The soul of the mitzvah are the emotions that are in the mitzvah that you do. Now, chapter 41 and 42, we spoke about awe of God. However, we also spoke about, when we spoke about the awe of God or the fear of God, we were speaking about, as we will call, the lower level of fear of God. As we explained, the very basic premise in fear of God is to know that God is watching. And so when you know that God is there, um, that you behave differently, just as when anybody is in the room, right? When anybody is in the room. So if we were to um, that was the first chapter. However, we are going to now delve deeper into a deeper level of awe of God and a fear of God, and we're going to explain to you why. And the entire uh, chapter is based upon itself, as I always said. The Tanya is written for a scholar and a layperson. So the Tanya is based on uh, a saying in Pirkei Avot, an ethics of our fathers. Let me just pull this up for you so you can see it in here. So there's a fascinating statement in Ethics of Our Fathers. Okay, so let's take a look at it. Um, okay. All right, so it says like this. Let's take a look at the Mishnah. So here's from Pirkei Avot. I believe it's chapter 3, Mishnah 17. So we have Rabbi Eliezer ben Azar, Rabbi Elazar, not Eliezer. Elazar's different names. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah said, where there is no Torah, there is no right conduct. So in other words, if you don't have Torah, you will not conduct yourself properly. And then he says, where there is no right conduct, there is no Torah. Okay? But that's not our focus today. Our focus today is where there is no wisdom, there is no fear. Where there is no fear, there is no wisdom. Okay? So that is our point of reference and discussion. And the question is, what does this mean? Anybody wants to posit? What does it mean? Anybody wants to give me a thought what it means? Do you guys hear the baby in the background? Just curious.
I can answer.
Huh? Yes, okay, go for it.
Um, Well, okay. So the obvious would be there is no wisdom. You're talking about where there is no wisdom, there's no fear of God.
Hmm.
Um, well, it sounds like it means that to be wise is to understand.
Well, it doesn't say understand, it says fear.
Right. And when the deeper an understanding, the more you understand the magnitude of his power and you fear him.
Okay, so you're saying the more you understand God, the more you're going to fear him, right?
Maybe.
So that explains the first line, where there is no wisdom, there is no fear. And I think everyone could understand that easily, right? In other words, in order to have fear of God, you need to understand him. I think that's really been our whole discussion till now, which is we don't see God. So if you don't contemplate and think about God, you're going to have trouble fearing God. Okay. But then the next question is, what does it mean where there is no fear of God, there is no wisdom? If wisdom is the prerequisite to fear, then how is also fear the prerequisite to wisdom? Where do you start?
The problem is that some people believe the more intellectual and sort of that's along the lines of wisdom that you are, the less their God makes sense. That's all I have to say.
Okay, very good. Yes, that is there. So there are many ways of reading the Mishnah, and at the simple layer, that is indeed the meaning of the Mishnah. Indeed, the simple meaning of the Mishnah is that your wisdom is not wisdom if it doesn't include fear of God. Okay, but if we are to interpret the entire Mishnah talking about spiritual wisdom, then the question does become more magnified. In other words, there's two ways to read what wisdom is referring to. You can either say the wisdom in both statements are referring to different wisdom, but if we are to say we're talking about wisdom, understanding of God, then the question is, why does it say where there is no fear of God, there is no wisdom? And so the Tanya's answer is going to be is that we're actually talking about two different layers of wisdom. We're talking about um, two different layers of fear. And there is a fear that comes after wisdom, and there is a fear that comes before. It's really two different statements. And that's why we have those two. So um, let's take a look at. I'm wondering if I should take a look at the text already. Let's take a look. So the first layer of fear. Um, I'm not sure if I want to go into it, but let's take a look. Actually, yeah, let's look in the Tanya. Okay, we'll look in the Tanya, chapter 43. He says like this, okay? He's going to talk about the first layer of fear, and he's going to give it two different layers. He says like this. Chapter 43 continues the Tanya's practical guide to generate emotions for God, which began in chapter 41, and will continue to end of chapter 50. In chapter 41, we were given an introduction to the importance of reverence and love and how to achieve them at a basic level. Chapter 42 elaborated further on ideas and techniques to generate reverence. Obviously, reverence and love can occur at different levels, but what is our register to calibrate these different levels? Our previous discussions have guided us to mainly recognize basic and lower forms of reverence and love. In this chapter, we will explore higher forms of these emotions and clarify what distinguishes them from the lower counterparts. And as I said in my text, and why is it even important to have a higher level of reverence? He says like this. Now, regarding the lower reverence, this is a good summary, which we have discussed in chapters 41 and 42, which we defined as any reverence that directly inspires the observance of God's mitzvos, both prohibitions and positive commandments, to turn away from evil and do good. Regarding this lower reverence, our sages said, if there's no reverence, there's no wisdom. Okay, so this is the first layer. Imin yira ein chachma, which we said, right? If there's no fear, there is no wisdom. As we learned in chapter 23, the notion of both a lower reverence and a higher reverence, lower reverence which leads to observance of Torah, and a higher reverence which results from Torah observance, is suggested by the Mishnah's teaching. If there's no reverence, there's no wisdom. If there's no wisdom, there's no reverence. Let's take a look. The Mishnah's first statement, if there's no reverence, there's no wisdom, which, by the way, in the text that we read here, it's the other way around. There's actually two different versions of reading this. Okay, so you know, so the other way to so the Mishnah's first statement: if there's no reverence, there's no wisdom, points to the lower level of reverence that inspires you to the Torah wisdom. So, in other words, you need to have reverence of God in order to reach Torah wisdom and Torah appreciation. Because, as we said, because and obviously you need to study about God in order to reach that lower level of wisdom, lower level of reverence. But the point is to keep Torah mitzvos requires a basic level of reverence. The Mishnah's second statement, if there's no wisdom, Torah, there's no reverence, suggests a higher level of reverence which comes after Torah observance. And so this is going to be the answer of explaining the Mishnah. Number one, the Mishnah that we read is though it is an accepted version, is not the version that is written in Chabad Siddur. And number two, we're talking about two different layers of reverence. There is a basic reverence and there is a higher reverence. And the higher reverence you can only reach when you study the Torah. And I'll just to give a pause for a moment here, why that's so important. Um, Many people think that spirituality can exist on its own. And what we're making the argument here is that actually the highest levels of spirituality can only exist once you are doing Torah and mitzvos. In other words, um, the to be one can be spiritual at a lower level without Torah mitzvos, though it would probably lead to Torah mitzvos. But if someone truly wants to attain a high level of spirituality, it requires observance, it requires deeds, it requires action, it requires study, deep study. But that's a very, very important point because, again, we live in a world where many people want to attain spirituality. And I will argue, based on what the Tanya is saying here, is that their spirituality is always going to be limited. The Rebbe used to give us interesting example in different areas. A similar concept we can apply it here as well. Imagine someone who is trying to who needs a certain pill and for their mental health. And again, not getting into whether it's overprescribed or not, but let's assume somebody needs a certain pill for their mental health, and um, they don't understand why they should take the pill. And so the answer is when you take the pill, you understand why you need the pill, right? But the Rabbi used to say the same thing. In other words, when you do Torah mitzvahs, then you'll understand more why you need to do the Torah mitzvahs. So in other words, the whole concept of trying to understand the mitzvahs before you do the mitzvahs doesn't necessarily work. You might understand God, you might appreciate God, but the point is, doing Torah mitzvahs helps you reach to higher levels of understanding and appreciation and spirituality. Now, the Tanya is going to back up for a moment. The Tanya is going to say, before we get to this higher level of reverence, he wants to argue that even in lower reverence, right, the reverence that leads you to just following what God asks of you, there are actually two different layers of appreciation of God. There is um there is the reverence that is called the expanded reverence, and there's reverence that's called very minimal reverence, if you want to put it like that. Not minimal, but very focused, very limited. Let's put it limited, okay? Let's let's explain this, okay? What's the difference between an adult's understanding and a child's understanding? It's really the adult has the ability to see an expanded view of things. Children have a very limited and narrow-minded view. It's a benefit sometimes. You can easily get them to do things, which an otherwise older child will not do it because they see the larger picture of what you might be trying to get them into. On the flip side is when it comes to good things, children cannot see the larger picture, and therefore sometimes in order to get them to do something good, you need to convince them with the lollipop, okay? So sometimes you need to convince a kid not to cross the road with the lollipop. So though it works, um, it's because the child has a very narrow view of the world. So children typically have a very narrow view of anything. As we get older, our minds expand and we can appreciate more, okay? So let's take this to our understanding of God. Okay? A child understanding of God would be a simple understanding that God is here and um, that God is watching, and therefore I don't want to disappoint God. Okay? It's a very, very simple point that children can get. God is here. You don't want to, God is asking you to do this, so you should be doing it. It's a more, right? Children have the song, Hashem is here, Hashem is there, Hashem is truly everywhere. It's the Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, right? Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai said, as long as you know God is there, you'll do the right thing. So we tell kids a very, very simple statement. Very, very simple idea. Know that God is here, He's watching you, do the right thing. Um, a adult, though, can come to appreciate God from seeing the wider world around them. In other words, a child doesn't yet have that expansive type of mind. For an adult, you can come to appreciate God by looking at the world. You see the sun, the moon, the stars, you could nature, science, and by seeing the world, you can appreciate God. So a contemplation, as we said last week, we brought different contemplations. The more you recognize the greatness of this world, the more you see God everywhere. That's not really in a child's wheelhouse because their minds are not that expanded. Okay? So this is the next point of the Tanya, is that in lower reverence of God, there's a very focused, narrow-minded reverence of God, and there's a more expanded reverence of God. The more mature adult brain that can appreciate more about God. Let's take a look at this. He says like this. Within the category of low reverence, there's a contracted, cottonless frame of mind and an expanded, godless one. By the way, you should know we say that in the morning prayers, it says, why do we have the longer prayers in the morning? Because it's a time of godless hamochin. It's a time of expanded mind. We had this earlier in the Tanya. In other words, in our morning prayers, we have more of an ability to connect with God in a more expanded way. Whereas in afternoon and evening, less so. Practically, we're more tired in the afternoon. So, there are times when you're studying and you're like catching out, you have a broader view of things. It's something you're like literally just struggling to understand the exact line you're reading. That's what this means. Sometimes we have this contracted frame of mind and sometimes we have an expanded frame of mind. So lower reverence from a contracted frame of mind is what we have been discussing through chapters 41 and 42. A basic awareness that God is watching, deducing his presence by looking at the contents of the physical world as his garments. No, no, no. There's different ways of understanding this, Tanya, and I'm going to not follow this explanation here because basically there's two types of expanded minds. There's an expanded mind in the lower reverence, as in there's an expanded mind in the higher reverence, as I'll explain. Meaning to say, when the reverence is produced by meditating on God's greatness, it's considered to be from an expanded frame of mind. Um, in an expanded mind meditation, I'm just going to skip that commentary there. You contemplate how he fills all the worlds. You ponder the awesomeness of God as expressed through the myriads of spiritual and physical worlds. But whatever, in a contracted frame of mind, the emphasis is on you. You know what? I'm going to go to the next thing. And you can also contemplate that a journey from the earth to heaven takes 500 years, and the thickness of the heaven is a journey of 500 years, and so too between each heaven and one above it, and the feet of the angels are equal to all them together. Okay, so what am I reading here? The Talmud tells us that it takes a 500-year walk uh, between heavens. Anybody wants to take the walk? You get a lot of exercise. So obviously it doesn't mean a physical distance, but it's to give us a little bit of an appreciation of what it means that, you know, we think spirituality is like, one tier, two tier, three tier, four tier, five tiers. Heaven is like endless, and each layer of heaven is so far from the next one. And so it's to help us appreciate that the more you can think about God, the higher you can go. Let's take a look at um, let's continue. Let's continue inside. He continues, and an expanded mind meditation will also include meditation on the chain of the spiritual worlds, extending up and beyond to the greatest heights. But as the Tanya will now explain, even this expanded mind meditation will only produce lower reverence. Nevertheless, the reverence produced from this above meditation is still a superficial and lower reverence. Why? It's superficial because it's inspired by the greatness of God as manifested through the created worlds, which are mere garments of the King and the Blessed Holy One, who has founded them only in a hidden, concealed guard way, so as to energize them and sustain them. So there should be something from nothing. So let me explain what's going on here because this is very confusing. Okay. So again, what we've established in this chapter is when I meditate about God, I can have like a childlike understanding of God, a very, very simple understanding of God. Just God is here, God is watching, and therefore I should do what God wants. Then I can have a higher level of reverence of God. And in the higher level of reverence of God, I am thinking about more focusing on things I know about God. Okay, so I know the world. By meditating about the world, I can understand a little bit about the greatness of God. When I meditate about even the spiritual worlds, I see the greatness of God. The problem is, as he explains, that um, the problem is that all of these meditations only take place in the garments of God. In other words, we're not meditating about God Himself. You recognize things that God creates, and thereby you are appreciating God. Um, so what's the problem with this? What's the problem with meditating about God? So let's think about it like this. Has anybody ever, nobody here has seen a king, so it's very hard for people to relate to this. But if someone fears a king, they fear the king, as we explained earlier, but they're not actually fearing the king himself. They are fearing what the king's ability is. In other words, it's not about the king himself, it's about his ability. You would stand in front of that king with uh, trembling and humility, but the truth is, you're not actually afraid of the king, you're afraid of his position and his ability. If he were to be taken over by another king tomorrow and you would see that same king, you would have no fear in front of him, right? In other words, the king himself is not fearful only because of what he can do, because of his position, because of where he is and what position he holds. Okay? Conversely, let us say you are in the presence of a tzaddik, of a righteous person. Okay? Everyone talks about they go to the Lubavitcher Rebbe and the eyes, they talk about the eyes standing in the presence of greatness. Okay, but any tzaddik, any very righteous person, and you stand in front of this tzaddik, there it has nothing to do with their position. It has to do with who they are themselves. In fact, there's many stories of people who met a tzaddik, not, when they were hidden, and they were just completely overtaken by them. There's a story actually about the Alter Rebbe himself that that many times in his imprisonment that many of the guards and soldiers would meet him and they realized that this is a very, very holy man. And it's one of the reasons he was freed from prison, from the Russian prison. In other words, the Russian government could have put an end to him. They weren't afraid of him because of the position he held amongst the Hasidim. They appreciated his personality himself. And so that's really the issue over here. Now, as we think, if we look at the world and we're like, wow, this God is so great. But the problem is you're not appreciating God himself. You're appreciating what God has done. So the end result is you are fearing God and you will listen to what he wants you to do. But it's not an appreciation of God himself. It's an appreciation of everything around God. Okay? Conversely, So that's why even the expanded meditation, when your mind gets larger, when you can appreciate God to a larger extent, right? Even in the expanded meditation of God, the problem is that you are, unfortunately, um, really just, um, even with the expanded meditation, you are really just meditating about God, not about God himself, things about God. I don't know if this blur, this background works very well. Okay, let's take a look. Let's take a look at Tanya, what he says about this. He says like this. He says, however much your emotions might be stirred by these meditations, you're not actually getting excited about God himself, but rather is God's influence, the wondrous worlds that he has made. That's why it's termed a superficial reverence. Okay? So you might say, so Rabbi, if you're telling me it's a superficial reverence, it's not about God himself, it's about things about God. So why do we even bother ourselves with a lower reverence if it is inferior and superficial? So he says, only lower reverence is important since it is a gateway and a passage to the observance of Torah mitzvos. Emotional maturity follows a process. First, there must be a lower reverence, which will inspire Torah observance, and that opens up the further possibility of reaching higher reverence. You can't skip levels because one builds on another. So, what does this mean? This means that you can't skip, right? You can't skip steps. So, the reason why we start with the superficial reverence is because that's where we need to start. That's the starting point. But we should never get comfortable and just stay there because we have to understand the downside of that love of God. So I want to ask you a question. Um, the meditations that we've said till now, even in the expanded meditations, are the typical meditations that we would think are meditations about God, right? In other words, when we try to impress ourselves about God, we look at the world, we look at science, we think about how the great spiritual worlds are so amazing. So what would it even mean to feel whatever this higher reverence is? What would it even mean to appreciate God himself? In other words, a human being I can appreciate, but I can't meet God. So how would I have a greater, in other words, what is expected of me? How can I have a reverence of God that is not just about God or appreciating things that God has done, but a focus on God himself? Any thoughts? Anybody's any thoughts? Or if you're not with me, I know this is a deep concept. Anybody has any thoughts? What could be a deeper reverence of God, a reverence of God himself? And it's not just appreciating the world around us, but appreciating God himself. How would that even be possible?
So meaning like, hi, um, not like learning Torah, like that's not the answer.
I'm not saying it's not the answer. I'm taking all answers. Okay. It's good thought learning Torah. Okay. Any other thoughts or
Like,
anybody else?
and the mitzvahs.
Okay. So the Torah and the mitzvahs. Okay. Now, what you're saying is based very much, it has a good source because we said a moment ago that the higher level, I can't do that right now, the higher level of reverence comes after you do Torah mitzvos. So you're definitely on the path to something here. Okay, anybody else? But by the way, what this tells us is that, from my understanding, all spirituality that exists out there in the world is limited because they're all going to be limited to focusing on things about God and not God himself. All right. Well, let's see what Tanya will develop for us. So we so far have a problem. We're basically saying, as great as we will contemplate and meditate about God, we're going to be limited to contemplating and meditating things about God. Okay? So let us move on to what would be a better type of meditation. So he says like this. But the higher reverence is a reverence arising from a sense of shame in God's presence. Now, I know the word shame today is gone out of style, let's put it that way, right? But I would differentiate there's toxic shame and there's good shame, right? In fact, I think it's a problem in today's society. People have lost a natural shame. Like you should, right? We used to say you should be ashamed of yourself. Now, again, maybe it's overused and abused and whatnot, but there should be a place that we should have correct healthy shame. There should be a healthy shame. Right? Nobody goes to the bathroom in the middle of the street, okay? Where you should have that level, that basic level of shame. I keep mentioning, I've been reading this book about somebody who was in prison, and he actually writes in there that one of the biggest problems in prison that that in the cells they have a toilet and you go to the bathroom and there's no privacy. And he says there's many people in prison, they're there for 20, 30 years. They get over a lot of the indignities of prison, but they never get over that one. There's like something natural about that. Unfortunately, there are people that do, but generally that's like a healthy shame. Right? So let's continue. But the higher reverence is a reverence arising from a sense of shame in God's presence. Okay, that's similar to what I said earlier, right? To the shame you might feel in the presence of a Rebbe, of a tzaddik. You're ashamed not of what they can do to you, but of their presence, of who they are. And it is a deep reverence, um, which results from an awareness not of the awesomeness of the spiritual worlds themselves, but of the core godliness within the worlds. Okay, so again, you're not awed by, wow, these are such cool worlds that God's creating. Okay, that is the effect. Instead, you're focusing not on the worlds, but you're focusing on the energy that is vivifying the worlds. Okay? Think of the difference between the way you're impressed by a powerful man and the way you're impressed by a holy man. So here he gives this example. There are two major distinctions. A powerful man impresses you of what he can do. His influence, a holy man impresses you because of who he is. Higher caliber of human being. B, being in the presence of a powerful man doesn't really change you, but being in the presence of a holy man might deeply impact your life. When you're impressed with a powerful man, you're not really revering him, but his influence. The thought of all that power may overwhelm you, but it doesn't change you inside. In fact, by the way, just pausing here, I may argue that even while you are, even while, um, that, e that even while you are in that person's presence, you might be thinking in your mind that you don't really respect them. You're just scared of them, but you have zero respect, but you're afraid of them, right? If you're in front of a dictator, you would have zero respect in front of that dictator, but you'll also be afraid to your core to do anything wrong. Right? So this is what he's arguing. You're the same person as before. You've just encountered someone else who's much more powerful than you. That's like being impressed with the awesomeness of the spiritual worlds. You're impressed by what God can do, but not by God himself. Right? So you see, there's so many spiritual worlds, and what God is greater than that. Wow, wow, he's powerful, he's big, he's mighty, he's incredible. At higher reverence, you start to feel the actual presence of God himself, the core godliness within the worlds. You are revering God for who he is and not what he can do. To describe how the experience changes you, higher reverence is also referred to here as reverence from a deep sense of shame. When you are in the presence of a holy man, you begin to question your own inner worth. If another person can be that holy, that refined, what does it say about you? You begin to feel that by this standard, your life's achievements are embarrassing. That if this is what a human being can rise to, then you haven't even begun yet, right? Certain people can, in a interesting way, being in the presence of greatness can inspire you to do more. Again, if the shame is used in a healthy way, inspire you. Wow, if this person can reach that, what can I accomplish in my life? Not that you're expecting yourself to be like that person, but to be more of yourself. Similarly, the experience of higher reverence is one of losing your identity in the presence of God. You begin to vacate and transcend yourself. You connect with the reality of God, which leaves no room for other separate existence. Before I get to those lines. So, in essence, like this, if you have an appreciation for the greatness and power of God, you will do what God is asking of you. But will you change in your inner core? Not necessarily. You appreciate God's power, you appreciate He's there, and you understand that you should be following what He says. He is the great, mighty, powerful God. But if you are appreciating the inner core of God that's in the world, then the energy, God's life force and energy, then you actually begin to change. You begin to, just like, again, when you stand in front of a powerful person, you don't change inside, you will just follow what they say. But when you stand in front of a great person, you change. When you feel God's presence Himself, not just His awesomeness and His mightiness, but the see God Himself is also great and mighty, but He's much more than being great and mighty. When you start to feel God Himself, you start to lose yourself in um, the energy that we might call God. Um, this piece of Tanya is really a hard one, which is why so many people have trouble with it. Let's see. Let's take a look at the practical lessons. In this Tanya, they give you practical lessons. Let's look at the left. Let's look at the left side here. He says like this: if your reverence is inspired by the fact that God is watching you, or by the fact that the world veils His presence, then you have achieved lower reverence from a constricted state of mind. If your reverence is inspired by the awesomeness of God as expressed in the spiritual worlds, then you have achieved lower reverence from an expanded state of mind. Higher reverence comes from an awareness, not of the awesomeness of the spiritual worlds themselves, but of the core godliness within the worlds. So if you were to imagine, um, trying to think of a good example. Let's take this. Today people worship athletes. Let's put the difference like this. Someone can be impressed by what the athlete is accomplishing, right? And so they stand in front of whatever, pick your athlete, whoever you really like, and you're really impressed by, wow, look at look at um look at what they've done. I mean, this is an incredible human being and their accomplishments and their ability to and their desire to win and all that. That's one layer. But then, what if you appreciate the person behind the accomplishments? What if you begin to appreciate, well, how are they accomplishing all that? They their work ethic and their desire to win um and their um and their tenacity and their desire, their unquenchable thirst for greatness, okay? So think about the difference between those two scenarios, right? In the first scenario, you're like, wow, and you're standing in front of the greatest player or whatever it is ever, right? But it won't change who you are. It's just like, wow, look at what they can do. But then when you appreciate the energy behind the accomplishments, that has much greater effect in the changing power of you. So I don't know if it's the best example, but you're already seeing, a much more expanded mind, right? And here you can give an example, right, between a kid and an adult. A kid will really just know what they've done. They can watch them winning, right? I remember I grew up with Michael Jordan. All I really knew was, wow, he keeps winning. Okay, it was great. It was a great basketball player. I had no inner more appreciation of his inner desire to win or anything else. Um, so when it comes to, so we can apply a similar lahavdil, a similar concept over here. Are we appreciating God because we're looking at his accomplishments and therefore we're saying, wow, he's great? Or are we focusing on the energy that's within the worlds? In other words, not focusing so much on the worlds, but focusing on the vivifying force that is God that is within the worlds. And then we are connecting deeper with God himself. We're connecting deeper with the essence of God. Let's read should I read a little bit more here? Um Yeah. So now he's going to show this in the text itself, how this is the idea, is that the deeper level of wisdom is not just seeing the world, but seeing the energy behind the world and appreciating it. Let's take a look. It is of this higher reverence, the sages said, if there's no wisdom, there's no reverence. Okay, that's the higher level. If there's no wisdom, uh, there's no reverence. How do you reach higher reverence? The Mishnah indicates that it's through accessing our chokhmah, our wisdom, as the Tanya will now explain. Since, as we learned above, the term chokhmah, wisdom, is a fusion of two Hebrew words, koach, power, and ma, what? The power to say, what is this? Which someone just posted in the chat. Your chokhmah's identity is not centered around itself. It's predominantly an energy of inquisitiveness and openness to the other. Since this doesn't have a sharply defined self-identity, it's sufficiently open to recognizing the true reality of God, which leaves no room for separate existence. Okay? So, in other words, um, Bina is to understand what exists. Chokhmah is to question, to to dig deeper. The objectability, today people aren't really objective. It's hard to even describe this anymore. Chokhmah is the ability to be objective. I mean, do we know anybody that's really objective? No, but objective means to even question myself, question the premise upon which I live. So when I'm focusing on the world and the beauty of the world, and wow, God is, creating this beauty, and therefore I appreciate God and His power. I'm not questioning the world. I accept the world as it is, and I say, wow, that's an incredible world. And therefore, if God creates this incredible world, I should revere the God that can create this incredible world. But when you use your chokhmah, which means your ability to see beyond the superficial layer, and you start to say, well, does the world really exist? The world is just really God's energizing energy at every single moment. And without that energizing energy at every single moment, the world would not exist. You're less focused on your existence. You're becoming more, you're recognizing more the not reality of the existence. The fact that the existence of the world is not so powerful and doesn't have such a great grip and hold. Again, this is a complex concept. I'm trying to bring it down. So let's just again bring it. I think this is why there's a lot of spiritual people out there who are nevertheless um not, very much focused on themselves. How is it possible to be spiritual and be very self-focused? Because if your meditation reference is about the world or Mother Nature or the universe or whatever else it is, as people contemplate and meditate on, if that's your point of reference in your meditation, even if ultimately it leads you to understanding God, what you've basically told yourself is, wow, this world is incredible, this world is great, and there's a great God that creates it. But the focus is on the greatness of the world and hence the greatness of yourself as well, right? Um, However, if your focus is on something that the Tanya teaches, not on the greatness of the world, but I meditate on the fact that the world would not exist without God's energy inside of it every single moment. Now, my point of reference is really the world doesn't really exist. There's a godly energy that is making it special. So, again, this takes us back to chapter 20 and 21, where we basically explained that though this world looks incredible, this world requires God's energy inside of it every single moment. So, for example, um, this cup that I'm holding, right? If I let go of it, it falls to the ground. So is this cup a flying cup or a floating cup? No. It happens to be here. Okay, it happens to be here. But really, the moment I let go, it's going to fall to the ground. It doesn't really belong floating. It doesn't really belong existing. We explained in chapter 20 and 21 the same thing as this world. this world really, really doesn't belong existing. The nature is there's no world. Okay, there's just God. God is choosing every single moment to keep the world existing, like I'm holding up this cup. Okay, so the world is practically existing, but it doesn't need to exist. And God chooses every single moment to recreate that world. So, one meditation is to think about the cup itself or think about the world itself and say, wow, look at this beautiful cup, right? The problem with that is that you remain you, the cup remains a cup, and you're just impressed by the wondrous things that God is doing, right? So again, you're not impressed by God himself, you're impressed by his effect. But if I think, wow, this cup really doesn't belong here. All that really is here is God. Now, instead of thinking about myself and the world around me, I'm now thinking about God. That's really the difference. So again, it's kind of the difference between the king. With the king, you're focused on, when you're impressed by the king, you're focused on what the king can do, and you're focused on his power and might in the world around you. You're not impressed by the king himself. Whereas with the highly spiritual man, you're impressed by the spiritual person himself. And similarly, if we focus not on the effect, which is the world itself, but on God's energy, then I'll take questions in a moment. But when we focus on God's energy, then the point of reference is less on us and more about God. And so it allows us to get to a higher spiritual plane. Yes, what's the question?
So God, so at every moment, you said like a big Tanya concept is that like God is recreating the world at every moment.
Yes.
Where could I read about that in the Torah?
Um, what do you mean where can you read about that in the Torah?
Like some that's a like interesting idea, concept, but I don't know where 100% it comes from.
Okay. So, um, like a lot of things in Jewish thought and teachings, it's in the Torah, but doesn't mean you'll be able to understand it or see it directly from the Torah itself. This is primarily discussed in the second section of Tanya. Um, this is primarily discussed in the second section of Tanya. But the core of the question goes like this. When God creates the world, okay, can the world, once God created it, can the world exist by itself without God?
If God deems it to.
All right, God can technically do anything, okay? Putting away God's technicality. The way we understand creation, the way we understand how things work, logic would tell us, and again, there are verses that back this up, this is indeed what God did. But logic would tell us that God would require constant creation, just as the cup, right, requires me to constantly hold it up, otherwise it falls down. The entire existence of the world is contrary to the nature of the world, and therefore requires God's constant creation. Okay? The only reason that um, the Tanya has it at length about this again in the second section. But again, the only reason we think that God can create something and not have to deal with it anymore would be because we confuse tweaking something to creating something. In other words, if I take if I take my phone and I take the case off the phone, right? The case is going to remain off of the phone until I put it back on. Why? Because these are already created things and I'm just altering, moving them around. So it doesn't require me to constantly do anything, okay? Right? If I separate them, they'll be sitting separate forevermore until I put them together, right? But that's because I am manipulating things that already exist. However, when it comes to things that don't exist, which is this entire world that God is creating, that is something that needs a constant energy of God because naturally there is no world. Okay? And so the world requires God's constant energy in the world. It's based on a verse. It says in the verse, "Forever, God, your words are standing in the heavens." And what that means is we know God created the world through speech. And that means that God's speech that created the world is actually constantly in the world. The moment God removes his energy from the world, it will cease to exist. Similar to a refrigerator. The moment you pull the plug, it stops working. If God were to remove his energy from the world, it would cease to exist. Okay? And therefore, based on this idea, okay, a deeper meditation would be not to focus on the greatness of the world itself, but on the power of God that is constantly within the worlds. So yes, I start, maybe I look at the worlds, but I'm not so much thinking about the worlds, but I'm thinking about the godly energy that's in the worlds. Let's take a look here at some text. I hope that answered to some extent. Let's take a look at this text. He says like this. He says that chokhmah, wisdom, is the ability to question, to be curious. Okay? And as scripture states, the chokhmah ma'ayin timatzeh, chokhmah comes from where? Me'ayin literally means from where, but it can be translated from nothing. Your natural tendency is to feel yourself as solid and taking up existence. But when you access your chokhmah, your wisdom, you sense that your experience, existence is fluid and intangible nothing because it's really a part of God. The Talmud also hints to this transpersonal energy of Chachma with the teaching, who is a wise person? He who sees the future outcome, that which is born. Meaning that when you use your Chachma, you perceive how everything in the universe is born and comes into being continually something from nothing. Normally, a meditation is carried out using Bina, your cognitive powers of understanding, but Bina can't get you to a higher reverence because it's too bound up with your ego and self concept. It's not capable of appreciating the fluidity of your existence. Bina has too much of yourself involved because it works through the tools of analysis that you've taken years to develop and have become bound up with your worldview. Chokhmah, on the other hand, doesn't analyze the situation. It simply sees things the way they are in the mind's naked eye. Again, objectivity doesn't exist today, but that is the truth of Chokhmah. It's objectivity, and therefore, okay, so what does it mean that you be objective and you can see beyond your physical self? Your Chokhmah will enable you to see how the world is utterly dependent on God's creative powers, God's word and breath of his mouth, as the verse states, and the breath of his mouth all the world's contents came to be. And if so, that the universe and its contents have no independent existence, which means that apparently separate identity of the skies and earth and all their contents are in reality voided by the power of God's, by the power which creates them continually, to which they owe their existence, the power being God's word and the breath of mouth. I'm going to skip because we discussed that outside. And your Chachma enables you to perceive how all separateness is considered zero literally and null and void. Oops. Null and void. Null and void. Like the. I don't know why this is over here. Uh, like the rays of the sun are voided of their individual identity within the globe of the sun itself. So when you see that, you come to appreciate God himself, not just the world, but God himself. But in order to do that, you have to exit your view of the world. Then he continues, and he just says at the end, and a person should not remove himself from the group, meaning that all the components of your soul, your nefesh, ruach, and neshama, are also voided of their identity by God's word, and God's speech is one with him just as a thought. I'm not getting into I don't want to read this because we're running out of time, but basically what he's saying is like this. A lot of times we come to meditate. Um, a lot of times we meditate, and we realize how the world is nothing, but we fail to realize how we are also bound and one with God. Does that make sense? In other words, a lot of times you can meditate and realize how, wow, the whole world is relying on God's existence. But also think about yourself. You are also truthfully relying entirely on God's existence. I want to make a little bit of a summary here of the difference between um of the difference between Uh, the awe, they had a good summary here. I just want to give it to you. Um, so you can walk away with something practical. Um, it was over here. One second. It says like this. Okay. Let's take the differences between a fear, a awe of someone's power versus a awe of the inner person themselves. Okay. Number one, when you have fear of someone's power, um, you are afraid of, number one, you don't appreciate the person themselves. You just are forced to listen to them, right? They used to say certain people would imagine God like this big lion, this big scary lion, so they used to be afraid of him, right? So you're not afraid of God himself, or you're not afraid of, you're not afraid of the king himself, you're afraid of what he can do. Number two, um, number two, it doesn't change the inside of you, right? So those are the two problems. When you're fearing someone for what they can do, number one, you're not fearing the person themselves. So I guess we could say the problem is both me, the person who's having the awe, how am I changing? And also, what is my connection to that person? When the awe is focused entirely on the person's power, then A, I am not focused on the person themselves, but on their power. And then B, I myself do not change because I am just focused on their power, but I don't have any real, uh, I don't change in myself. I am just forced to do the right thing. And that's the problem if we only fear God because he's standing here and he's watching me, um, then A, I am just fearful of what he can do. I'm not fearful of God himself. And number two, um, I myself don't change. Okay. However, when we were to appreciate God himself, which we haven't really explained well how we are to appreciate God himself, but we've given you an idea. We've said, stop thinking about the world and how amazing the world is, and therefore God must be amazing. Focus on the energy of God that is vivifying the world. Okay, but when we focus on God Himself, number one, we're having a relationship with God Himself, not just God's effect. And number two, I myself will change more because I'm not just afraid of God. I'm not just following Him because God is mighty, but I have an appreciation of God Himself. And again, we really don't have time to go much further in this for today. It is a complex chapter, and like I said, that's why people bow out, in later chapters. But I hope you're appreciating now. What I want you to walk away with today is Jewish spirituality versus worldly spirituality. Jewish spirituality basically tells us after you get your first layer of appreciating God through appreciating the world, you need to come to appreciate God Himself because until you get that, you are truly not having a relationship with God Himself. You are having a relationship with what God can do. And I would say a lot of the Musar, okay, a lot of the Jewish ethics that is taught, not Hasidus, but a lot of the Musar talks about, let's say religion, to talk about heaven and hell. Again, you're not having a relationship with God. You're having a relationship in that case with what God can do. And Tanya wants you at the deepest level, when you can get there, to have a relationship with God Himself. Just like you can have a relationship with your parents, you're afraid of them when you're a child, but the ultimate goal is that you want to have an actual relationship with the parent themselves. We should strive to have a relationship with God Himself. How? We're going to have to develop that more in previous weeks. But that's, I would say, the takeaway of today. Our goal in life is not just to have a relationship with the power of God, but to have a relationship with God Himself. And that is the mature relationship, not the childish relationship, but that is the mature relationship. We need to start with the child relationship because we'll never get to layer two without that. But the ultimate goal and the greatest thing that we can achieve in life is to have that deeper level of relationship with God Himself. I know it was a complex class. I appreciate you all for coming, and hopefully we'll clarify a little bit more next time.